I'm going to be talking about the religion aspect of the New World Order in this video, and I will be discussing how the idea of aliens is going to be used as psychological warfare and is used to this day against us. So, you have some of the Italian lineages active today, like the Orsini family, Medici, etc., and these names, some of them I've called out in previous videos, and they would oversee the various power structures of society, essentially, and the Committee of 300 in particular. Now, the thing is, members of the Committee of 300, not all of them are blood related to that of what we call black nobility. So, groups that are underneath the Committee of 300 would be like the Bilderberg Group or the Trilateral Commission and things like that. But some of the members, which are generally former Holy Roman Empire members and those of European royalty, would be like Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, the Windsor family, and Habsburgs and Rothschilds, for instance, which I'll be talking about the Habsburgs a little bit later. But those people essentially are nothing more than, we'll say, guardians of the treasury, if you will, considering Rothschild just means red shield, which, like the Roman legion red shield, right? So, here, just shifting topics, we have something called the Book of the Law, which was created by Iowas or Aleister Crowley, or a combination of both, depending on your outlook. But essentially, this is the book that forms the basis for his religion he called Thelema, which is like where the term "do what thou wilt" is the whole of the law comes from. And I'll leave it open to your interpretation as to whether Crowley acted as a medium for Iowas, if he was possessed by Iowas, communicated with Iowas, etc. I'll leave that up to you. The whole point that I'm getting at here is this book was created called the Book of the Law, and as well, the other thing that happened here, I'll leave this link, by the way, in the description, so that you can read the story yourself if you'd like. Now, the other thing that happened was that this was drawn, and Lamb, otherwise known as Iowas, is the entity that Aleister Crowley supposedly communicated with or was possessed by. And this looks strangely similar to that of what we call the alien gray. So, just want to point that out to you. And here I just want to talk a little bit about Islam very briefly, because there's a reason why Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are referred to as the Abrahamic religions, and it's that Muhammad believed he had gotten the revelations from God that were revealed in the Torah and the Gospels, but he identified this revelation with Abraham and the message that God is one, and that's why those three, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are referred to as the Abrahamic religions. However, he viewed that those who were deviating from the Quran were in error. And I'm not, just because it's implied that Christianity predates Islam, I don't take one religion over the other, because religion to me is nothing more than the same of a political party, where they're just distortions where you think in small boxes, essentially, and you cannot leave those small boxes, if you will. So, now that I've explained the Abrahamic religions, I'm going to talk about the idea of aliens and something President Ronald Reagan had said in 1987, which was very distinct. This is a series of a few different speeches where he talked about the quote-unquote alien threat, if you will, and he says to Nicholas Gorbachev, he talks about a conversation he had with Nicholas Gorbachev, who is the last living leader of the USSR. He says, how easy it would be to unite if everybody had to face a threat from another species, from another planet. So, essentially, imagine looking at all of the crises and problems around you, and then one grand crisis, if you will. It seems like unity through crisis is the modus operandi of the cabal. So we just see this taking form on a much greater scale. And their tricks that they use are nothing new over time. They're just rebranded, that's all. So we can see here, for instance, the way that Allatra has described this public movement, which I just want to actually, before I describe that, this is one of those movements that are pushing for the idea of the New World Religion, just like the Lucis Trust, but they just go about it a little bit differently. And if you take the term Allatra, you have Allatra, which is the Arabian pagan fertility goddess, which is like the equivalent of Aphrodite to an Arabian pagan. And then you have Ra, which is the sun god in Egypt. So the way it's described here is that they're honest and friendly people who aspire to use their best qualities for the benefit of society. Sure, it's a new format of relations regardless of nationalities, profession, social status, religious, and political views. So unity is great regardless of view. I agree with that at face value. However, you're going to see as we go on that this organization is not necessarily about unity for a positive reason, if you will, because a lot of their videos contain ideas of all religions, including those of Eastern philosophy like Tao and Buddhism, and use aspects like Shambhala to convey their views, if you will. However, they're just trying to fuse all religions together in different ideas, and I'll talk about some of the projects which they have here. You have the universal grain, which is the main task to analyze the modern specifics of spiritual development, the degree of awareness and understanding of the main elements of the value context of the religious worldview in the world community. So basically it's a study of religion in the world. And then you have the Allatra Global Partnership Agreement, which is the basis for practical implementation of the spiritual and creative society model by means of establishing an entirely new format of relations between people in the labor field of society, and is based on the universal, human, spiritual, and 7 Allatra foundations, which here they list as the value of life, freedom of choice, power over oneself, spiritual and moral self-improvement, unity, creation, and spiritual riches. So unity, creation, and spiritual riches, I think, are the 3 things that stand out to me most, because they're unifying in terms of a threat, which will eventually come up as pre-programmed via Ronald Reagan as he talks about a threat. And how this threat comes to form, I don't know exactly. However, I do struggle to believe in the idea of aliens, extraterrestrials, and this idea of outer space, if you will, because a lot of these concepts and distortions of reality essentially come through the Jesuits, which I'll be talking about later in the video, and how a lot of creations in society actually affect our very outlooks of reality on a day-to-day basis, actually. So we see that Allatra, and in particular one of the projects, Creative Society, has its blessing from Pope Francis, this other religious leader in Armenia here, and then you have an imam of the oldest mosque in Germany. So you have an Islamic face, and then you also have a Catholic face, if you will, for a sign of approval or a stamp of approval on Allatra. And we can see that some of the people here that are members, we have people from different think tanks and different media outlets, artists, etc. And you have a wide, diverse range of people to cover all grounds. So, for instance, you have somebody in even European Parliament here, member of Parliament's Committee on Transport and Tourism, if you will. So you also have politicians. And you have Robert Kennedy, who's the president of the Atlanta Council. And then you have Margaret Habsburg Lothringen. So I'll talk about the Habsburg family as well as the Atlanta Council, just to give you an idea here. So the Atlanta Council was behind something in 2016 where there was there were leaked emails from DNC, which is the Democratic National Committee. And what they are essentially is when the Democrats are in power, they're just an extra arm of the White House that, if you look on Wikipedia, it'll talk about they're an additional fundraising group, but they're more like an additional arm of the Democratic Party, if you will. So apparently some emails got leaked in 2016, and it exposed things about, the Clintons and that sort of a thing. However, the idea of Russian hackers, this idea is complete propaganda and nonsense, because the Washington Post, you can see uh, this article cover here. It says Russian hackers were found in the DNC's computer network. It says, while the Post story by Ellen Nakashima was sourced to committee officials and security experts who responded to the breach, like CrowdStrike, which is a security firm hired by the DNC, the attribution dropped out of the headline, presenting Russian government culpability as an unquestioned fact. So they didn't even mention CrowdStrike at all, which is the security firm that's actually put together, that's actually supposed to guard the Democratic National Committee. They didn't even mention CrowdStrike. And this kind of a story was pushed by groups like the Atlantic Council. And then the other additional person I want to speak to you about is this person here. Well, in particular, the Habsburg line, actually. Just to give you an idea, you need to go down to page 11. And on page 11, it talks about the Swiss here, where it mentions that the court Jews, such as Rothschild, Warburg, Oppenheimer, Sassoon, etc., worked through the Roman Curia or royal courtrooms such as Buckingham Palace. The French Rothschilds worked for the black nobility of Rome and the French House of Orleans. The British Rothschilds worked for the British Crown. The Sassoon and Kadoorie families worked for the British Crown and oversee banking and business in China and India. And the Swiss Rothschilds worked for the House of Habsburg and the House of Hesse. So, and then you also have the Oppenheimers, which work for the German House of Württemberg and the Cologne Oppenheim branch. The Austrian House of Habsburg granted them titles of nobility. So essentially, you have the Oppenheimers, which are known for the diamond trade in Africa. You have the Oppenheimers and the Rothschilds that are actually beneath the Habsburgs in terms of their fake scale of hierarchy, if you will. So that's just to give you an idea of black nobility that's actually involved in pushing this agenda here. So going back to Allatra a little bit, they actually have several YouTube channels, and in particular I'm going to be going over some of the videos here briefly, and I'm sorry for the load time. The first one is called Artificial Intelligence versus Artificial Consciousness. What is the fundamental difference? And so essentially here, there is an individual who works for Allatra called Igor, who voices his opinion in creating artificial consciousness on December 29th, 2019. And then they visit a group called XP-NRG, which is apparently the world's first creators of artificial consciousness, in March of 2020. And there is an artificial consciousness given the nickname of Jackie by XP-NRG on May 16th, 2020. And psychiatric examination on Jackie was actually carried out by several psychiatrists and experts, for instance, from Switzerland. And now, it says that AI is limited in many aspects. However, artificial consciousness has a range of capabilities used for science, will change how we view the world and understand who the human being is and how the universe emerged. So essentially, this group, Allatra, is also normalizing the idea of AI or artificial consciousness, or even fusing with AI on some level, if you will, where we use it in our day-to-day life. They don't vocalize any protest against that. They're actually all for it. And then you have another video here called, Is the Vatican Friends with Extraterrestrial Civilizations? The Vatican is gearing people for the so-called coming of these ETs. However, this phenomenon are where atheists and religious people tend to find common ground. So yes, atheists and religious people tend to find common ground when talking about aliens in outer space, actually. So this is why that idea is very well going to be propagated for the aspect of a new world religion, if you will. So this video, are UFOs technology of the future, or are they forgotten past? I don't discredit that of technologies that are used against us, that perhaps are not even, the existence is not even revealed to the public. I don't dispute that whatsoever, but when you attach aliens or outer space to something with a very lackluster explanation, it seems like the very lazy way out. And so this video takes into account, it talks about artifacts, figurines, and structures and mummified remains, and explains our contact and collaboration with ETs in order to explain a lot of those things in this video, which again, like I said, is a lazy explanation. And when it comes down to things like very big structures or pyramids and giant rocks and that sort of a thing, the thing that people don't really take into account, and I could make really whole entire videos on this, and there are various channels that talk about this, but going through the 1800s to the early 1900s, you can find articles of bones that are uncovered that are between 7 and 20 feet roughly, and possibly even bigger than that. But the idea of giants walking among us was actually a very normalized thing, if you will, when you look at pictures from the early 1900s and people that actually existed in society with us. However, gradually over time, these people were put into circus freak shows, if you will, and the idea of giants became that of myth when you see eventually through the 30s and the 40s, Disney became prominent actually. So they very much took the idea of things that are normal and put them into that of fictitious categories for us. And so as well, this video doesn't really talk about frequency or somatics, and I know that frequency, sound frequency, and vibration, when I say those three words, you're going to lump me into a new age category. But the reality here is frequency is a very big part of how we actually function on a day-to-day basis. It's just that it's a very overplayed fact in the new age, whereas this is not something they even really touch on. And the thing is somatics is the idea where the study that each frequency or sound has a unique geometry. And I do think that this is something that they don't really talk about when they speak about things like the pyramids and that sort of a thing. So I don't claim to have all of the answers. I mean, Allatra will claim to have all of the answers, but I'm just talking about what's missing from these discussions when these very big subjects are brought up, and I'm just trying to get people to critically think here. So, for instance, they talk about the Apexians, if you will, in their narrative, and the Apexians are very similar to that of an alien gray, and they depict them as having a sort of collective consciousness, if you will, but depict that they do not have a soul. However, the Apexians, if you will, look at needs of the group rather than that of the individual. That's the kind of narrative that they're trying to spin here. And they also depict that 25,000 years ago we were enslaved by this group, and we apparently had to ask the quote-unquote Anunnaki for help. And there's a woman who works in this organization who calls herself Zana that claims to be one of these Anunnaki walking among us, and they have really ridiculous visual effects in these videos where I'm just going to sound like Queen Romana Didulo if I actually talk about this. It becomes quite ridiculous. But the thing is they give the narrative of the Anunnaki being beings from outer space, and this is very much a Zechariah Stitchin narrative, but they don't talk about how the Anunnaki and groups like that actually come out of ancient Mesopotamia, and how eventually those are names that change when you come down to Acadia and then Babylonia, all its way down to Rome when you have those planetary names, if you will, right? So essentially they're just pushing the idea of space wars, and that when you say that we were enslaved by the Apexians, if you will, that this sets up a stage for a false flag event, and they now have people believing in this spectrum. And I don't try to preach to people about flat earth or about the globe model, any of those, because fact of the matter is the flat earth movement is controlled, and you see penal signs like this within their movement saying, oh, flat earth, but in reality what that actual sign is that I'm doing is a cut across the chest, which has to do with the Freemasonic Messiah figure, Hiram Abiff. And you can see that essentially everything is distorted, and the Flat Earth movement is a very divided movement in and of itself, and is a very controlled movement, very much like anybody who actually preaches the globe model, as a matter of fact, because the thing is, this guy, George Lemaitre, is the guy who started the Big Bang idea, and he worked for the Vatican. He was a Jesuit. So, and the Big Bang works hand in hand with evolution, which comes of Darwinism, which is where atheists follow. So, how does that actually work with the church, if you will? So, and then you also have Nicholas Copernicus, which is the guy that thought of the heliocentric model, and guess what? He was also a Jesuit. And then lastly, you have Christopher Clavius, who's the guy that brought in the Gregorian calendar, which he was yet a Jesuit. So what I'm saying is that the very aspect of how we see reality, if you will, and a lot of these quote-unquote discoveries, I use that word very loosely, comes through the Vatican, if you will, which is just essentially shaping our ideas of reality. And now, talking about the quote-unquote Anunnaki, if you will, in Sumeria, you had Inanna, right, which is this particular stone tablet here, and then in Acadia, the name had changed. In Acadia, Babylon, and Assyria, you had Ishtar, and in Phoenician, you had Astarte, in Greek, Aphrodite, and in Scandinavia, you had Freya eventually. So, all of those all coordinate, all kind of co-link with one another is my point that I'm getting at here. And when you think about the word Astarte, it literally has star right in its name. And these terms really predate that of the Roman gods, if you will, which use planetary bodies as names, like Venus for Lucifer, for instance. And we see Ishtar actually coordinates with Venus, so there you go. And if you actually look at the Latin root for star, you get Stella, which is where you get the term Stella Maris, which is Star of the Sea, or the Virgin Mary, if you will. So, again, I'm not trying to preach any worldview here or tell people that all reality they know is a lie, but all of the ideas that we were taught in school, at the very least, is that much of a fabrication, and anything that comes out of the Flat Earth movement as well is very divided, where you see people say they don't believe in space whatsoever, and then you see people say as well that there's just a giant donut floating in space, and you have all these very different ideas, but the reality is everything is a distortion, and you should really be thinking for yourself and not believe any sort of ongoing narrative that is just thrown at you, because at the end of the day, every movement that was created or that has the illusion of being grassroots was created in order to deceive and destroy, essentially, and their motto is order out of chaos. Do not fall for this false flag alien invasion when the time comes. I do not know what form this will take place, but when it does, I'm sure we will all know. Anyway, take care and thanks for listening.